The fortress did not belong to the 21st century. Standing in the dust-choked plains near Mazar-i-Sharif, Qala-i-Jangi, the fort of war, was a sprawling mud-brick behemoth that looked like a relic of the Crusades or a fevered dream of Genghis Khan. Its walls, 18 feet thick and 40 feet high, were built from sun-baked earth and straw, a massive rectangle of ancient defiance that had survived the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and decades of fratricidal Afghan conflict. But in November 2001, as the first cold winds of the Hindu winter began to bite, this medieval relic was about to become the site of the most concentrated explosion of violence in the opening chapter of the global war on terror. To understand the disaster that was about to unfold, you have to understand the geography of desperation. The Taliban's northern front had collapsed. After weeks of relentless American aerial bombardment and the swift ground advance of the Northern Alliance, a loose, fractious coalition of Uzbek, Tajik, and Hazara warlords, the city of Kunduz had fallen. Thousands of Taliban fighters had surrendered, but among them was a specific residue that the Northern Alliance generals deeply feared: the 055 Brigade. These were not local Afghan farmers turned fighters. These were the foreigners, an elite legion of Al-Qaeda volunteers from Chechnya, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and the Arab heartlands. They were the true believers. They were men who had burned their passports, cut their ties to the world of the living, and traveled to the mountains of the Hindu Kush to seek a martyr's death. For them, surrender was not a tactical pause. It was a ritual of shame. And they were being transported, 600 strong, in the back of open-top trucks, to the southern courtyard of Qala-i-Jangi. The Northern Alliance commander, General Abdul Rashid Dostum, a man whose reputation for brutality and survival was legendary across Central Asia, had decided to use the fortress as a temporary holding pen. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Dostum's men, flushed with the arrogance of victory, had failed to conduct thorough searches of the prisoners. They saw the hollow eyes and the blood-stained tunics of the Al-Qaeda fighters and assumed they were broken. They didn't realize that under those tunics, hidden in the folds of heavy wool shawls and tucked into the tops of boots, were grenades, bayonets, and a suicidal resolve that had been forged in the training camps of bin Laden. Into this powder keg stepped two Americans. They were not soldiers, but in the gray space of 2001 Afghanistan, the distinction was irrelevant. Johnny Mike Spann and David Tyson were officers of the CIA's Special Activities Division, SAD. Mike Spann was a former Marine captain, a man of quiet, athletic intensity, who embodied the American species of the early war, driven, patriotic, and perhaps too trusting in the temporary stability of the Northern Alliance's grip. David Tyson was an Uzbek-speaking linguist, a man who understood the vibe of the region better than almost anyone in the agency. Their mission was simple but vital: screen the prisoners. The CIA needed to know who these men were. They were looking for high-value targets, for the thinking cadre of Al-Qaeda, who might know where bin Laden was hiding. They had set up a small folding table in the middle of the southern courtyard, surrounded by hundreds of seated prisoners. They were protected by only a handful of Northern Alliance guards who were more interested in looting the prisoners' few remaining possessions than in maintaining a secure perimeter. While the Americans were beginning their interrogations, a small, inconspicuous team was moving through the northern half of the fortress. They were 8 men, dressed in a mix of civilian trekking gear and local Afghan clothing. They carried specialized weaponry, suppressed C8 carbines and Sig Sauer pistols, and they moved with a synchronized autonomy that set them apart from the chaotic Northern Alliance soldiers around them. These were the ghosts of the SBS, the Special Boat Service. In the world of special operations, the SBS is often overshadowed by its more famous brother, the SAS. But within the Tier 1 community, the SBS is regarded with a specific, hushed reverence. If the SAS is the scalpel, the SBS is the ghost in the water. Their selection process is notoriously more difficult, centered around squad, the swimmer-canoeist qualification. While the SAS candidates are broken on the hills of the Brecon Beacons, the SBS candidates are dismantled in the freezing, lightless waters of the English Channel and the swamps of the Poole Harbor. They are trained to operate in the austerity of the abyss, where cold and sensory deprivation are the primary enemies. The 8 men at Qala-i-Jangi were from M Squadron. They were there as a liaison and reconnaissance element, supporting the Northern Alliance advance. They were thinking soldiers who had spent years in the shadows of the world's most hostile maritime and jungle environments. When they looked at the southern courtyard, they didn't see a successful prisoner transfer. They saw a tactical vacuum. They noticed that the guards were undisciplined. They noticed that the Al-Qaeda prisoners were not looking at the ground, but were scanning the walls, counting the steps, and watching the guards' weapons with a predatory focus. "This is going to go south," one of the SBS operators reportedly remarked to his team leader. It wasn't a guess. It was a professional pattern analysis. The vacuum shattered at 11:15 a.m. on November 25th. The spark was a single Al-Qaeda prisoner who had been brought forward for questioning. As Mike Spann approached him, the man suddenly lunged. It wasn't a punch or a grab. It was a suicide breach. The prisoner pulled a hidden grenade from his tunic, detonated it, and used the blast as a signal. Simultaneously, hundreds of prisoners rose as one. The violence was instantaneous and absolute. The Northern Alliance guards were overwhelmed in seconds. Their AK-47s were snatched from their hands and turned against them. Mike Spann, standing in the middle of the courtyard, drew his pistol and began to fight. He was the first American to die in combat in the war, but he didn't go quietly. Witnesses later described a lone man in the center of a screaming mass of 600 fighters, firing with reflexive precision until he was buried under the weight of the numbers. David Tyson, the other CIA officer, managed to draw his Browning high power and fire his way through the initial surge, sprinting toward the North Fort, the administrative and living quarters of the fortress, where the SBS team and a few Western journalists were located. As Tyson reached the heavy wooden doors of the North Fort, screaming that Spann was down and the prisoners were loose, the 8 men of the SBS didn't panic. They didn't call for a big army evacuation that they knew was hours away. They didn't wait for a committee to tell them what the rules of engagement were. They practiced the Hereford binary. They grabbed their Bergens, checked their suppressed carbines, and moved toward the sounds of the gunfire. The behemoth of mud had become a fortress of death. The Al-Qaeda fighters had occupied the southern courtyard and were now breaking into the armory, seizing thousands of rounds of ammunition, RPG-7 launchers, and heavy machine guns. they had effectively taken control of half of the most formidable fortress in Afghanistan. They were 600 men with nothing to lose, facing 8 British operators and a handful of disorganized Afghan soldiers. This was the 17th second on a massive scale. Part 1 of the Battle of Qala-i-Jangi is the story of the botched silence. It is the story of how the arrogance of victory and the failure to understand the residue of the enemy created a catastrophe. It is the story of 2 Americans caught in a storm they couldn't control, and 8 British ghosts who were about to prove why quality is the only variable that matters when the world turns into a slaughterhouse. The SBS team moved to the ramparts. They looked over the mud walls and saw a sea of black-turbaned fighters pouring out of the basement levels, armed and ready for a final stand. The thinking soldier looked at the machine of chaos and began to calculate. They weren't thinking about medals. They were thinking about angles of fire, sectors of suppression, and the binary excellence required to survive the next 10 minutes. The fort of war was about to earn its name, and the clock of the SBS was just beginning to tick. The transition from the clinical silence of an intelligence screening to the sensory overload of a full-scale infantry uprising is a psychological bend that most soldiers never survive. At 11:20 a.m., the southern courtyard of Qala-i-Jangi was no longer a prisoner of war camp. It was a vertical slaughterhouse. David Tyson, the CIA officer who had survived the initial surge that claimed Mike Spann, reached the massive wooden gates separating the North Fort from the South Fort, with his Browning high power locked back on an empty chamber. Behind him, 600 Al-Qaeda foreigners were screaming in a dozen languages, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline, religious fervor, and the realization that the Northern Alliance had handed them a second chance at martyrdom. Inside the North Fort, the 8 men of the Special Boat Service, SBS, reacted with the austerity of logic that defined their selection in the Pool Harbor. They didn't shout. They didn't run in circles. They moved in mutual support pairs, their hands instinctively checking the seals on their magazines and the optics on their C8 carbines. In the American Big Army system, an uprising of this scale would have triggered a massive force protection protocol: retreat, consolidate, and call for armor. But the SBS operators were thinking soldiers. They knew that if the prisoners took the North Fort, the uprising would transition from a riot into a regional catastrophe. They had to hold the wall. The North Fort was separated from the South Fort by a massive internal mud brick wall, nearly 20 feet thick. At the top was a narrow rampart, exposed to the sky and pitted by decades of bullet impacts. The 8 SBS operators, led by a squadron commander who practiced the Hereford binary, ascended the crumbling stairs. They reached the top just as the first wave of Al-Qaeda fighters reached the armory in the southern courtyard. The armory at Qala-i-Jangi was a tactical nightmare. It was packed with the residue of 20 years of war. Thousands of AK-47s, crates of F-1 grenades, RPG-7 launchers, and, most terrifyingly, heavy PKM machine guns and boxes of 12.7mm anti-aircraft ammunition. The prisoners, who minutes ago were shivering in shawls, were now becoming a mechanized insurgency. They were breaking open crates with rocks and bayonets, arming themselves with a speed that spoke to their years of experience in the camps of Chechnya and Pakistan. Sectors of fire! Pick your targets! Controlled pairs only! The SBS commander's order was a clinical anchor in the chaos. The 8 men fanned out across the ramparts. In the world of special operations, this is the multiplication factor. 8 men against 600 is a suicide mission by any conventional metric. But the SBS didn't use conventional metrics. They used ballistic dominance. As the Al-Qaeda fighters began to pour out of the armory, thinking they could swarm the ramparts through sheer quantity, they met the quality of the British Tier 1. The SBS operators didn't spray. They used the 17-second clearing logic applied to an open battlefield. They identified the high-threat nodes, the men carrying RPGs, the men setting up machine guns, the men who looked like they were giving orders. The suppressed C8 carbines made a sound like a staple gun against the roar of the uprising. Thud thud. A rebel with a rocket launcher is neutralized before he can shoulder the weapon. Thud thud. A PKM gunner is shot through the head as he attempts to feed a belt of ammunition. The SBS were practicing surgical suppression. Every round was a tactical decision. They were selecting the enemy out of existence. But the medieval nature of the fort created a geometry of the kill that favored the prisoners. The mud brick walls were porous. The Al-Qaeda fighters began to use the stables, a series of arched concrete and mud rooms along the base of the wall, as bunkers. They were firing upward at the ramparts. The SBS operators were silhouetted against the bright Afghan sky, their only cover being the jagged, crumbling battlements of the 19th century fort. David Tyson, the surviving CIA officer, had found a German journalist's satellite phone and was screaming for help. "We are in Qala-i-Jangi. Mike Spann is down. We are under heavy fire. We need everything you've got." The first reinforcement element to arrive was not a battalion of infantry, but a small, 4-man team of U.S. Army Special Forces from ODA 595, the Horse Soldiers. They were led by Captain Mark Nutch, men who had spent weeks riding horses across the Hindu Kush to coordinate the Northern Alliance advance. They arrived in a dusty Toyota Hilux, their beards long, their faces masked by Pakol hats. They weren't big army, they were thinking soldiers who spoke the same language of binary excellence as the SBS. They were joined by 2 other CIA SAD officers and a lone Air Force combat controller, CCT, named Alex. The species on the ramparts was now a hybrid of British Tier 1 and American JSOC/SAD. They were the scalpel of the Western world, trapped in a mud castle with 600 men who wanted to die. The CCT, Alex, began to coordinate the angels of the sky. Overhead, a Predator drone was already orbiting, its thermal cameras providing a God's eye view of the carnage to a command center in Florida. But on the ground, the reality was danger close. The Al-Qaeda fighters were so close to the base of the rampart that the SBS could hear them breathing. They were throwing grenades up onto the wall. The air was filled with the smell of homemade explosives and the sharp, metallic tang of blood on sun-baked dust. "We need a strike on the armory," the SBS commander said. "If we don't take out that supply line, we run out of brass before they run out of men." Alex, the CCT, began to chant the incantations of fire into his radio. "Target is the southern armory structure, large mud brick building. Grid 42 Echo. Requesting JDAM danger close. We are on the north wall." A B-52, Stratofortress, circling at 30,000 feet, received the coordinates. It was a 1950s machine executing a 21st century command in a 19th century fort. It released a 2,000-pound GBU-31 JDAM. The SBS operators on the wall felt the pressure wave before they heard the explosion. The JDAM impacted the armory with the force of a tectonic shift. The mud walls of the South Fort groaned. A pillar of black smoke and fire erupted into the sky, carrying with it the residue of Al-Qaeda's ammunition supply. The explosion was so powerful that it momentarily sucked the oxygen out of the courtyard, silencing the screams of the uprising. But the Al-Qaeda foreigners were not deterred by fire. They were martyrdom-obsessed. As the smoke cleared, they rose from the rubble and began a suicide charge toward the North Fort Gate. This was the moment of mechanical exhaustion. The SBS and the Green Berets had been firing for 3 hours. Their barrels were heat-warped. Their ammunition was running low. The austerity of force was being tested to its absolute limit. The SBS commander looked at his men. They were covered in khaki dust, a mixture of pulverized mud brick and dried blood. Their eyes were vacant, fixed on the 17th second. They were no longer British or American. They were the standard. One SBS trooper, a veteran of the squad selection, had picked up a Russian PKM machine gun from a fallen Northern Alliance guard. He was standing on the rampart, his feet planted wide, firing into the mass of prisoners. He wasn't using the bipod. He was shoulder firing, a weapon designed for a crew. He was a human multiplication factor, a machine of reflex, who refused to allow the quantity to overwhelm the quality. "They're coming again!" David Tyson shouted, firing his pistol at a rebel, climbing a ladder made of stacked bodies. The Al-Qaeda fighters were using the human wave tactic. They knew the Westerners were few. They knew that for every ghost they killed, they would achieve a spiritual victory. They were crawling up the internal walls of the fort like ants. The SBS team began to use method of entry explosives as defensive weapons. They were dropping flashbangs and small charges directly onto the heads of the climbers. The violence was so close that the SBS could see the patterns on the rebels' turbans. This was trench warfare in the age of the global war on terror. But the geography of failure had one more trap for the defenders. As a second B-52 strike was called in to neutralize a heavy machine gun nest in the stables, the machine of the Pentagon suffered a catastrophic error. The GPS coordinates for the strike were fat-fingered or the satellite link glitched. The exact cause is still debated in JSOC after-action reports. The 2,000-pound JDAM didn't hit the southern stables. It hit the North Fort rampart. The explosion was a blue-white sun that turned the North Fort into a crater of mud. The SBS operators were thrown from the wall like rag dolls. The Northern Alliance soldiers were vaporized. ODA 595 was buried under 5 feet of ancient Afghan earth. In the post-strike vacuum, the only sound was the ringing in the ears of the survivors and the distant, jubilant cheers of the Al-Qaeda prisoners. They thought the wrath of God had finally turned against the Westerners. The rampart defense had been shattered not by the enemy, but by the technology that was supposed to be the force multiplier. Part 2 of the Battle of Qala-i-Jangi ends in the dust of betrayal. It is the story of how 8 men held a wall against 600, only to be crushed by a smart bomb. It is the moment where the thinking soldier has to decide if he will die in the dirt or rise from the rubble to fight a war that has no rules. The SBS commander crawled out from under a collapsed section of the battlements. His face was a mask of blood and grit. He looked at his broken team. He looked at the Americans struggling to breathe in the dust. And then he looked at the southern courtyard, where the prisoners were already preparing for the final breach. He reached for his C8 carbine. It was jammed with mud. He pulled a K-bar knife and began to clear the chamber. Selection, he whispered to the ringing in his ears, never ends. The fortress of death was just getting started, and the 17 seconds of the North Fort Gate were about to begin. The silence that follows the detonation of a 2,000-pound JDAM is not a natural silence. It is a ballistic vacuum, a sudden pressurized void that steals the air from your lungs and the equilibrium from your inner ear. At 3:15 p.m. on the second day of the uprising, the North Fort of Qala-i-Jangi was no longer a military position. It was a landscape of concussion. The smart bomb that was supposed to decapitate the Al-Qaeda surge had instead slammed into the very rampart where the SBS operators and the U.S. Special Forces were positioned. The blast had been so powerful that it had pulverized the 18-foot-thick mud brick walls into a fine, choking powder. For a moment, time stopped. The world was a grainy, monochrome blur of gray dust and the copper tang of blood. Johnny Mike Spann's colleagues from the CIA, the 8 men of the SBS's M Squadron, and the ODA 595 horse soldiers were buried under several feet of ancient Afghan earth. In the Hereford world, this is the biological Redline. This is where the athletes of the conventional military often succumb to the shock of the unexpected. But the SBS operators were the residue of the Pool Harbor selection. They had been trained to function in the cold vacuum of a capsized canoe in the middle of a winter storm. Their reflexive motor patterns were not dependent on sight or hearing. They were rooted in a deep, cellular will to survive. The SBS squadron commander was the first to move. He didn't know if his legs were broken. He didn't know if the ringing in his ears would ever stop. But he knew the pattern of the enemy. He knew that the Al-Qaeda prisoners in the southern courtyard would view the explosion as a divine intervention. He knew they were already moving toward the breach. Dig them out. Get the weapons hot. Now. The commander's voice was a ragged whisper, but it acted as a psychological anchor. The survivors began to claw their way out of the mud. It was a scene of primal desperation. SBS operators with perforated eardrums and fractured ribs were using their bare hands to unearth the buried Green Berets. They pulled David Tyson, the CIA officer, from a pile of rubble just as the first Al-Qaeda fighters reached the gap in the internal wall. The geometry of the kill had shifted. The defenders were no longer on the ramparts. They were in the dirt. The Al-Qaeda foreigners surged through the settling dust cloud. They were screaming in a ritualized psychosis, thinking the Americans were dead. They were met by a circle of lead. The SBS operators, their C8 carbines clogged with mud, had transitioned to their Sig Sauer sidearms. This was point-blank dominance. They were firing at ranges of less than 5 meters. One SBS trooper, a veteran of the squad selection, stood in the middle of the crater, blood streaming from his scalp, and executed controlled pairs into the chest of every black-turbaned fighter that emerged from the haze. He didn't have a plan. He had a standard. He was the human scalpel in the middle of a slaughterhouse. But the Al-Qaeda fighters realized that the North Fort was still a nest of ghosts. They began to retreat. But they didn't go back to the southern courtyard. They went down. Qala-i-Jangi was a medieval labyrinth. Beneath the mud brick behemoth was a vast network of basements, dungeons, and storage tunnels. The basement of bones. These were cold, lightless corridors built for a different century of warfare. The 600 prisoners, now armed with thousands of rounds and heavy machine guns, retreated into these tunnels. They were turning the basement into a subterranean fortress. This was the austerity of the abyss. The SBS commander looked at the dark openings of the basement stairs. He knew that a conventional army would never enter those tunnels. They would wait for the machine to starve them out. But the thinking soldier knew that the Al-Qaeda fighters were not waiting to be starved. They were preparing for a last stand that would turn the fort into a tomb for everyone. "We need the Spectre," the commander said to the Air Force combat controller. "Tell them we have an enemy in the foundations. Tell them it's time for the Hereford Thunder." At 8 p.m., the sky over Mazar-i-Sharif began to hum with a low-frequency vibration. It was the sound of 4 T-56A-15 turboprop engines. The AC-130 Spectre, the Angel of Death, had arrived. In the world of special operations, the AC-130 is the ultimate binary force multiplier. It is a 1950s cargo plane transformed into a flying artillery battery. It carries a 25mm Gatling gun, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a 105mm M102 howitzer. It operates in a pylon turn, a constant orbiting circle that keeps its weapons fixed on a single point on the Earth with the precision of a surgeon's needle. Alex, the CCT, established the link of faith. He was using an IR strobe light to mark the friendlies on the north wall. On the AC-130's thermal screens, the SBS and the Green Berets appeared as glowing white sparks in a world of cold gray. The Al-Qaeda fighters in the basement were ghost signatures, heat leaking from the vents and the open stairwells. Spectre 22, this is North Fort. We have an enemy footprint in the basement levels. We need a surgical suppression. Avoid the north wall structure. We are danger close. The Spectre responded with the Hereford Thunder. The 105mm howitzer fired from 2 miles up. The sound on the ground was not a bang. It was a tearing of the sky. The 105mm shell is designed to destroy tanks. When it hits a mud brick fort, it acts as a kinetic hammer. The first round impacted the southern stable roof, collapsing the tunnel entrance. The SBS operators on the ramparts watched as the South Fort was systematically dismantled by the machine. The 40mm Bofors cannon fired in rhythmic pulses, thump, thump, thump. The residue of the Uprising was being hosed by a stream of fire that no human could survive. But the thinking soldier realized that the AC-130 could not solve the basement problem. The 105mm shells were hitting the surface, but the Al-Qaeda fighters were 30 feet underground, protected by ancient, reinforced brick. This is where the human variable became absolute. The SBS commander gathered his team. They were the only ones who could go into the dark. They were trained for VBSS, vessel boarding search and seizure. They knew how to clear engine rooms and cargo holds in total darkness. The basements of Qala-i-Jangi were just engine rooms made of mud. We go in pairs. Night vision on, suppressors on. If you see a heat signature that isn't a brother, you end it. This is not a capture mission. This is a neutralization phase. The 8 men of the SBS descended into the basement of bones. The transition was total. They moved from the cold Afghan night into a world of stagnant humidity and the smell of industrial decay. Their PVS-14 night vision goggles turned the darkness into a sea of emerald green ghosts. They moved in the standard Hereford stack, their boots silent on the damp earth. The tunnels were a gallery of horrors. They found the bodies of Northern Alliance guards who had been dragged down and executed. They found crates of munitions that had been prepared as suicide traps. Suddenly, a heat signature appeared at the end of a long, narrow corridor. It was an Al-Qaeda fighter with a PKM machine gun. He didn't have night vision. He was firing blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flashes illuminating the tunnel like a strobe light. The SBS point man didn't hesitate. He didn't use his radio. He practiced binary excellence. He dropped to one knee, the IR laser on his C8 carbine painting a tiny, invisible dot on the rebel's forehead. Thud, thud. The silence returned to the basement. This was the 17th second in the underworld. For the next 4 hours, the 8 men of the SBS conducted a surgical sweep of the dungeons. They were selecting the enemy out of the foundations of the fort. They were 8 men hunting hundreds in a labyrinth where every corner was a potential tomb. Outside, the AC-130 continued its pylon turn, its 105mm cannon providing a metronome of fire that prevented any Al-Qaeda fighters from escaping to the surface. The machine was holding the lid on the pressure cooker, while the man was inside, turning off the heat. Part 3 of the Battle of Qala-i-Jangi ends in the emerald silence of the dungeons. It is the story of how the thinking soldier recovered from a catastrophic betrayal by his own technology, only to descend into a medieval nightmare to finish the job. It is the story of the SBS and ODA 595, 2 units that refused to be residue and instead became the scalpel of the abyss. As the sun began to rise on the 3rd day, the SBS team emerged from the basement stairwell. They were soaked in basement sludge, a mixture of groundwater, oil, and blood. They looked like subterranean priests of a dark religion. The North Fort was still standing. The Uprising was being compressed into a single, final basement chamber. The SBS commander looked at the Air Force combat controller. Spectre is off station. The tunnels are 90% clear. But there's a hard node in the central cellar. They've flooded it with fuel. They're waiting for us to come in so they can take us all to hell. He reached for a method of entry charge. We aren't going in. We're going to give them the Hereford irrigation. The Fortress of Death had one more ritual to perform, and the 17 seconds of the central cellar were about to begin. By the dawn of the 4th day, the behemoth of mud that was Qala-i-Jangi had been transformed into a landscape of industrial-scale slaughter. The southern courtyard, once a staging area for 600 elite Al-Qaeda foreigners, was now a graveyard of blackened earth, shredded turbines, and the twisted remains of Soviet-era weaponry. The Hereford thunder of the AC-130 Spectre and the precision strikes of the B-52s had decapitated the surface uprising. But the residue of the 055 Brigade had done something the machine of the Pentagon had not predicted. They had retreated into the deep architecture. 80 to 100 Al-Qaeda fighters were still alive, entrenched in the central basement of the North Fort. They were 30 feet underground, protected by walls of reinforced mud and stone that acted as a natural bunker against aerial bombardment. They had ammunition, they had grenades, and they had a suicidal resolve that made any direct entry into the stairwells a geometry of death. The SBS squadron commander, standing on the edge of the crater where his men had been buried by friendly fire only 48 hours earlier, looked at the dark maw of the basement entrance. He was a thinking soldier who had spent his career navigating the austerity of the abyss. He knew that a conventional infantry assault would cost him half his team. In the Hereford world, you don't trade lives for a basement unless there is no other variable. You don't hoo-ah your way into a dark room full of men with suicide vests. You find a mechanical solution. They won't come out for lead, the commander said to the Northern Alliance generals. And we aren't going in for them. We're going to use the geography against them. We're going to give them a cold baptism. The solution was as ancient as the fort itself: irrigation. Qala-i-Jangi sat atop a network of irrigation channels designed to keep the parched Afghan plains alive. The SBS and the CIA SAD officers, working in a synchronized autonomy with the local Uzbek commanders, identified a massive water main that fed the fort's central cisterns. They brought in industrial-strength pumps, relics of the Soviet agricultural era, and diverted the flow. They weren't just flooding a basement. They were weaponizing the cold. To understand why this was a binary excellence decision, you have to understand the physical reality of northern Afghanistan in late November. The water was being drawn from mountain-fed aquifers. It was less than 4 degrees Celsius. In the Hereford and pool selection processes, cold water immersion is the primary tool used to break the human ego. The SBS operators knew that while a man might find the spiritual strength to face a bullet, no amount of religious fervor can stop the biological shutdown of hypothermia. At 10 a.m., the pumps roared to life. A torrent of icy gray water began to pour into the basement vents and stairwells. Inside the basement of bones, the 80 Al-Qaeda fighters experienced a shift in the vibe of their martyrdom. For 3 days, they had lived in a world of dust and fire, expecting a final, glorious confrontation with the infidels. Instead, they found themselves in a rising tide of freezing mud. The water didn't just take their warmth, it took their lore. It soaked their gunpowder. It ruined their electrical detonators. It turned their fortress into a sinking ship. The thinking soldier watched from the surface. The SBS operators were not gloating. They were monitoring the attrition. They sat on the ramparts, their C8 carbines cradled in their laps, watching the vents. Every hour, a few black-turbaned men would struggle out of the water-choked holes, shivering so violently they couldn't hold their weapons. They were no longer Guevaras. They were residue. But the American species was about to face its most disorienting moment of the war. As the water reached the ceiling of the lower chambers, forcing the final holdouts to surface, a figure emerged from the central stairwell that didn't fit the pattern of the enemy. He was gaunt, his face masked by a matted beard and caked in the gray-yellow mud of the dungeon. He was shivering, his eyes wide with the concussive fog of the last 4 days. He didn't speak Pashto or Arabic. When an SBS operator ordered him to the ground, The prisoner responded in a voice that was unmistakably American. "I'm a Californian," he whispered. "My name is John." This was John Walker Lind, the American Taliban. In the world of the CIA and the SBS, this was a category error. To find a kid from the suburbs of Marin County, California, among the elite Foreign Legion of Al-Qaeda in a medieval Afghan fort was a psychological shock that momentarily froze the machine. David Tyson and the other SAD officers looked at Lind with a mixture of professional fury and genuine disbelief. Lind was the inverse species. He was a man who had used the autonomy of his Western upbringing to seek out the rigidity of the Taliban. He stood in stark contrast to the SBS operators, men who had used rigidity and training to achieve autonomy. "You were down there while Mike Spann was being murdered," Tyson said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "You were part of the 055. You're a long way from home, John." The discovery of Lind changed the aura of the battle. It was no longer just a victory over a foreign enemy. It was a revelation of a hidden threat within the Western world. But for the SBS, the priority remained the standard. They had to clear the courtyard. They had to find Mike Spann. As the final 80 survivors were processed, shuffling out of the basement like ghosts from a shipwreck, the SBS team moved toward the southern courtyard. This was the recovery phase. The southern courtyard was a tapestry of lead. Thousands of empty brass casings covered the ground like a metallic carpet. The SBS operators moved in a high-precision sweep, their eyes scanning the hundreds of bodies littering the dirt. They found the spot where the folding table had been. They found the residue of the CIA interrogation, and then they found Mike Spann. He lay in the center of a circle of fallen Al-Qaeda fighters. He hadn't died from a single shot. He had died in a swarm of violence. His pistol was empty. His tactical vest had been shredded. He had fought the quantity with quality until the very last second of his life. The SBS operators stood in a circle around him. They didn't offer hoo-ah salutes. They practiced the austerity of respect. In the Hereford and Poole world, Spann was a brother of the gray space. He was a man who had gone into the vacuum without a net and had paid the price of iron. "Pack him up," the SBS commander said. "We're leaving this mud hole." But the behemoth of mud had one final lesson for the thinking soldier. As they loaded Spann's body into a helicopter, the commander looked back at the North Fort. The uprising was over. 600 Al-Qaeda fighters were dead or captured. The Northern Alliance had reclaimed the fort. Mazar-i-Sharif was secure. But the commander realized that Qala-i-Jangi was not a victory of technology or numbers. It was a victory of patience. They had won because they were willing to wait. They had won because they had used the water and the earth to solve a problem that the smart bombs couldn't touch. The machine of the Pentagon would write the history books. They would talk about the JDAMs and the B-52s. But the lore of the SBS would remember the cold baptism. They would remember the 4 days on the ramparts and the 8 hours in the dungeons. Part 4 of the Battle of Qala-i-Jangi ends in the frozen mud of the aftermath. It is the story of how the thinking soldier faced his own dark reflection in John Walker Lind and how he recovered his fallen brother from a medieval courtyard. It is the story of how the standard survived the chaos of the uprising. As the Hueys lifted into the cold Afghan sky, The SBS team sat in the back, their faces still caked in the dust of the fort. They looked at the mud walls of Qala-i-Jangi one last time. The fortress of death was silent. The basement of bones was flooded, and the 17 seconds of the North Fort were over. But the global war was just beginning, and the thinking soldier knew that somewhere else, another vacuum was already forming. Selection continues. By the evening of the 7th day, the behemoth of mud was finally silent. The fires that had gutted the southern stables had cooled into a bitter gray ash that coated everything in a layer of industrial-scale mourning. The irrigation water that had provided the cold baptism to the final Al-Qaeda holdouts had drained away into the parched earth, leaving behind a floor of thick, stinking sludge that entombed the residue of the 055 Brigade. Qala-i-Jangi was no longer a battleground. It was a monolithic witness to the first great tactical collision of the 21st century. It was the place where the medieval world of the fortress met the digital world of the JDAM, and where the human spirit proved to be the only bridge between the two. The 8 men of the Special Boat Service's M Squadron did not stay to watch the Northern Alliance flag rise over the southern ramparts. In the world of the SBS and the SAS, the completion of a suicide mission is not rewarded with a parade. It is rewarded with a silent exit. As the American Hueys and Russian-made Mi-17 lifted off from the dusty plains outside Mazar-i-Sharif, carrying the wounded and the fallen, the SBS operators sat in the shadows of the cargo holds. They were metabolically exhausted, their bodies vibrating with the accumulated stress of 100 hours of binary excellence. They were covered in the khaki dust of the fort, a fine pulverized mixture of sun-baked mud, cordite, and the DNA of an annihilated enemy. They didn't talk. They didn't celebrate. One operator, a veteran of the squad selection, who had spent 8 hours hunting Al-Qaeda in the basement of bones, simply leaned his head against the vibrating hull and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the medals or the glory. He was thinking about the 17th second, when his carbine had jammed in the dark, and how his training had cleared the malfunction before his brain even registered the fear. This was the Hereford Pool Standard. You do the impossible. You survive the vacuum, and then you disappear before the big army can arrive to take the photographs. To these men, the fort was not a triumph. It was a resolved equation. Back at Hamworthy Barracks in Poole, England, the coastal fortress that serves as the home of the Special Boat Service, the cold debrief began. It was a clinical antiseptic process conducted in rooms that felt too quiet and too clean after the filth of Afghanistan. The 8 men sat in a room that smelled of sea salt and floor wax, thousands of miles away from the fortress of death. They were asked to download every second of the uprising, to turn their trauma into data for the next generation of thinking soldiers. The debriefing officers, men who had seen the shadow wars of the Falklands, the Oman Desert, and the Balkans, looked at the technical data. They saw that 8 men had held a wall against 600. They saw that the thinking soldier had survived a 2,000-pound friendly fire strike, not through luck, but through biological resilience and the ability to maintain cognitive control in a landscape of concussion. They saw the arithmetic of martyrdom, that for every SBS operator on the wall, nearly 75 Al-Qaeda fighters had been selected out of existence. The verdict is simple, the squadron commander reportedly said during the closed-door session. The machine of the B-52s and the JDAMs was a supplement. It provided the noise and the fire, but the man on the rampart was the only thing that kept the fort from falling. Technology provided the thunder, but the SBS provided the spine. Without the individualist on the wall, the JDAMs would have just been making holes in an Al-Qaeda-controlled castle. While the British were conducting their silent debrief, the United States was facing its own ritual of the fallen. At the CYA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a new star was being carved into the marble of the north wall. It was the 79th star, and it belonged to Johnny Mike Spann. Spann was the first American to die in combat in the global war on terror. To the big army generals who would follow, his death was a tragedy of security failure. But to the species of the Special Activities Division and the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, Spann was the genetic blueprint of the new era. He was a man who had gone into the vacuum of Qala-i-Jangi with nothing but a pistol and a thinking mind, and had fought the quantity until the very last 17 seconds of his life. The Spann standard became the benchmark for the CIA's paramilitary operations for the next 2 decades. It proved that in the gray space of the 21st century, the front line is not a border on a map. The front line is wherever a thinking soldier chooses to stand his ground. His sacrifice ensured that the machine would never again underestimate the foreign legion of the shadows. But the most haunting residue of Qala-i-Jangi was not the fallen hero, but the American Taliban, John Walker Lind. Lind was a category error that the Western world didn't know how to process. He was the inverse species, a child of Western autonomy and privilege, who had used that very freedom to seek out the rigidity of the abyss. His discovery in the flooded basements of the fort was a psychological short circuit for the American public. He represented the traitor in the mirror. To the SBS operators who had pulled him from the mud, Lind was not a warrior. He was residue of a different kind. He was a man who had tried to find certainty in the ritualized psychosis of Al-Qaeda because he couldn't handle the loneliness of choice in California. His presence proved that the vacuum of the fort didn't just attract the foreign legion of the East. It exerted a dark gravitational pull on the lost souls of the West. He was the proof that the war was not us versus them, but the disciplined mind versus the radical void. The final verdict of the fort, however, was strategic and far-reaching. Qala-i-Jangi changed the way the United States and Great Britain fought the rest of the war. It was the birth of the Tier 1 doctrine. The Pentagon and the Ministry of Defense realized that they could no longer rely on overwhelming conventional force to defeat a fortress of fanatics. They needed a global brain of special operations. In the years following 2001, the cooperation between the SAS, the SBS, Delta Force, and the SEALs became a fused entity. They moved beyond the exchange programs of Charlie Beckwith's era and became a single, integrated scalpel. The F3EA cycle, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, that would eventually decapitate the Al-Qaeda leadership in Pakistan and dismantle the insurgent networks in Iraq, was forged in the fire of the Qala-i-Jangi ramparts. They learned that quality is the only currency that doesn't devalue when the world returns to the medieval reality of the fortress. They learned that a 2,000-pound smart bomb is only as smart as the combat controller on the ground, who has the patience to wait for the target. And they learned that when the machine glitches, when the GPS fails, and the friendly fire falls, the only thing left to save the mission is the thinking soldier and his will to endure. Today, Qala-i-Jangi is still there. Its mud walls, scarred by the Hereford Thunder and the 105mm howitzers of the AC-130, are slowly returning to the earth from which they were built. The southern courtyard, where Mike Spann fought his last battle, is a field of weeds and broken stone, forgotten by the modern world. To the local Afghan farmers, it is just a fort of war, a place where the foreigners came to die in a storm of fire. But for the species of special operations, this is hallowed ground. This is the place where the 12 and the 8 proved that the human spirit, forged in the furnace of selection, is the most powerful technology on the planet. The SBS operators who fought at Qala-i-Jangi are now senior NCOs, or retired ghosts, living in the coastal towns of England. They don't give interviews to the BBC. They don't write best-selling memoirs about the basement of bones. They carry the residue of the fort in their silence. They know that they were the multiplication factor in a war that had no rules. They know that they survived the 17th second of a 7-day nightmare by trusting the man to their left and the standard in their mind. The final lesson of the behemoth of mud is the lesson of the residue. If you take away the satellites, if you jam the drones, if you flood the basements, and silence the machine of the Pentagon, what is left? If the answer is nothing, then you are already dead, and the quantity has won. But if the answer is the SBS, or the SAS, or the Delta operator, then you have a chance. You have a scalpel that can operate in the dark. The thinking soldier is the only weapon that doesn't require a battery. He is the only sensor that can sense the vibe. He is the only standard that doesn't change with the political seasons. The Fortress of Death proved that David Sterling was right in 1941, and Charlie Beckwith was right in 1962. It proved that a small group of exceptional individuals can change the course of a world war, provided they are willing to pay the price of iron. As the sun sets over the Hindu Kush, the shadows of the Qala-i-Jangi walls grow long and dark, stretching across the plains of Mazar-i Sharif. The fort is a tomb, but it is also a school. It is the school of austerity, of binary excellence, and of individual resilience. It is the place where the thinking soldier learned that his greatest strength is not the bomb he can call from the sky, but the residue of his own soul. And somewhere in the cold, lightless waters of the Pool Harbor, a new candidate is currently struggling to breathe. He is cold, he is exhausted, and he is functionally alone. He wants to quit. He wants the machine to come and save him from the freezing dark. But then he hears the ghost of the fort whispering in his ear, a voice caked in the mud and dust of a medieval Afghan dungeon. Selection never ends. The 17 seconds are always now, and the only way out is through the dark. The behemoth of mud is gone. But the standard is immortal. Who dares wins? By sea, by land,